All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us and supporting us in this cause of trying to create something a little bit different here. What I've done is taken a PowerPoint, modified it a little bit. We would have talked about this stuff in class. And what I want to do is provide you with information that'll help you for the AP test. So College Board is still planning to give the test. It's going to be probably taking it home online. They haven't decided what they're actually going to do with APUSH yet, but some of the other AP courses, they are doing one open-ended question for 45 minutes. College Board says that they're going to focus the question on skills. And so what I suspect they will ask you to do is take moments in American history, compare, contrast, talk about change versus continuity, things along those lines. So I want to help you with the content for the 1920s and how the material in the 1920s helps explain the overall narrative for U.S. history. So we're going to refer to this time period as 1920s boom to bust. We're going to focus here today on economic changes and political experiences that occur in the 1920s. I am going to reference some of the cultural material, but we will focus on the cultural material in another lecture and also utilize Fitzgerald's story that we gave most of you right before we went on this coronation. So let's go ahead and get started. There we go. Now it's working. All right. So first of all, regarding F. Scott Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald is generally considered to be the voice of his time. He was a member of the Lost Generation. And while we would love for you to read The Great Gatsby, we certainly didn't have time to do that. But what you guys can do is read the entire story of Diamond as Big as the Ritz and utilize the themes page that we gave you before going on break to organize the content from chapter 31. So I'll just put this slide up there. So we included an electronic copy of that themes page up in Schoology, so you can have access to that as well. So as you go through the cultural content in 31, try to use those themes and look for commonalities. Not so much worried about the Fitzgerald reading, but definitely focusing on those themes. So what we're going to talk about are some of the economic experiences in the 1920s. So we'll focus on manufacturing, access to jobs and credit, and development of consumer culture, and then unfortunately the downside of economically the 1920s, some of the farming problems. It is important to note that while this time period is referred to as the booming 20s, the roaring 20s, and many aspects of America, many demographics of America did benefit from the economic changes and boom time, not everybody experienced economic growth, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So I've been waiting all year for this moment, and that is to be able to work cars into our lecture. So what comes of this time period is development of this new car culture in the United States. And we had discussed that Henry Ford is one of the captains of industry. And some of the advancements that he did regarding development of the Model T had not only an economic but a cultural impact on the United States. So let's take a look at some of the production numbers. So the Model T was first produced in 1908, and production of the Model T continued until 1927. Originally, Model T cost you $837. And at that time in the early 20th century, not many were being sold. But if you take a look at the average price and models sold, you can see a real boom occurs after World War II. We get a low price of $275, and we're talking in the 2 million range in terms of models produced. And one of the things that allowed Henry Ford to be able to do this, to drop the average price of the vehicle, was development of the assembly line process. And we talked about how that was a combination of interchangeable parts that we saw with Eli Whitney, and the Chicago meat packing industry, right? So using conveyor lines and assembly lines or disassembly lines. Now to bridge from the economic front to the cultural front, Henry Ford did something that the other industrialists hadn't done, and that was pay his workers more and actually have them work less. What that did was it instilled a sense of pride in the product that his employees were making. So if there are any problems with the audio or slideshow here, just full disclosure, I'm doing this in one take and I don't have any ability to edit the slides as we go. So if there are a couple little pauses here and there, just try and bear with me on that. But so by paying his workers more and having them work less, they also could actually spend their money on purchasing Model Ts. So they actually ended up buying the very product that they were developing. And then on that day off, they could hop in their Model T, go driving into the countryside, and it now allowed people to actually go pick up a sweetheart, go on dates. So this economic change, this captain of industry, has an impact not just on production, not just on economic issues, but also on cultural issues in the 1920s. And so we even get development of this modern version of dating. Now let's take a look at employment numbers. And the numbers I have for you are post World War I all the way up to U.S. entry into World War II. So you see here in the graph goes from 1919 all the way up to 1941. And you can see from 1920 to 1921, we have an economic dip. That dip is associated with recovery from wartime production. So the factories that were producing war munitions had to shift gears from producing weapons to producing consumer goods. And so there's a very steep decline in employment figures, but as you can see, there's then a very quick rise for the remainder of the 1920s. And you can see it hits a peak in 1929, and then as we know, in October of 29, we have the stock market crash, and the bottom falls out of the economic system. And you can see here it drops down to 1932, 1933, the depths of the Great Depression. And as you guys know, that's the when FDR wins the election, and we have introduction of the first New Deal and the second New Deal. But ultimately, when you look at the employment numbers, it's the advent of World War II that really brings us to the zenith here, where we end up in just about full employment during World War II. So this gives you an idea economically how the time period of the 1920s plays in the larger story of the 20th century. And the last bit I'd like to talk about regarding manufacturing, jobs, and credit is the consumer credit market. So this graph picks up in 1920 and goes all the way up to 2009. And you can see in the 1920s that we start relying on credit, and we'll talk more about that when we discuss the roots of the Great Depression. When the Depression hits, we have this great increase in the credit market versus gross domestic product. Things settle back down, and then from the end of World War II all the way up to modern times, we see this steady increase. And you can see that's setting up for the economic crisis that we had in 2007, 2008 with the Great Recession. Now, let's go take a look at consumer culture. That's something that definitely changed in the 1920s. So we actually had an element of our economy develop and jobs develop that had not been there before, and that was advertising. So here are some famous advertisements from the 1920s. And what advertising did for the United States was it created an economic need. So generally prior to 1920s, early 20th century, Americans generally purchased what they needed. But we'll have a shift over to Americans being interested and willing in purchasing goods that they didn't even know that they needed. And advertising creates that need, right? So we start purchasing the wants instead of just the things that we needed. And you can see the, curves of youth, pull the cords, a chin reducer. I didn't know that I needed National Oats to make my kid husky, but apparently advertising says I do. Now, there were two different types of purchasing that then grew in the 1920s, installment buying and buying on the margin. So installment buying was putting a little bit of money down over a period of time to purchase a product that you weren't quite able to purchase in the first place. And buying on the margin specifically refers to stocks, where instead of purchasing the entire purchase price of the stock, you would put down a percentage of the stock. That would allow you to own the stock, to be in the stock market, and you would owe that money back after selling the stock. So what it allowed people to do was not only get into the stock market if they didn't quite have the traditional money that you would need, but it also allowed people to buy massive amounts of stock for a little bit of outlay. And we'll talk about how and why that causes a problem in the lead up to the Great Depression. During the boom time of the 1920s, you saw the information about the employment figures, so the perceived risk was relatively low in the 1920s. People felt that they could take out a loan to purchase stock and play the stock market because they were gainfully employed. The economy was doing well, and they had confidence they'd be able to pay back those debts. Now, the last piece I wanted to talk about here about the booming economy was the experience that the farmers had in the 1920s. So let me pop over here to this chart. So this graphs the impact of foreign affairs regarding farming success. And you can see that there's a real spike tied to World War I production for the farmers. And farmers were able to produce a lot of farm supplies, continued automation of the farming process, helped produce massive amounts of food. But when World War I closed out, the foreign demand for food slowed down. World War I was fought on the farmland in Europe, and so they had turned to us to be the breadbasket for the world. When World War I ends, that demand is no longer there, but our farming community had produced so much supplies that it actually ends up driving down prices. This will actually cause a long-term impact that we'll then see in the Great Depression with the advent of the Dust Bowl, right? So massive amount of farming, not rotating crops is going to lead to lower prices for the farm goods and robbing nutrients from the soil. Combine that with the drought that occurs in the 1930s, and it's going to really bring an end to that Jeffersonian view of America, right? The small farming America that we had talked about up to this point. And at the time in the 1920s, the bankers, they start calling up the loans on farmers, and farms are repossessed. And we discussed further, or back in the past, about how farmers often had to take on debt because they don't reap the benefit of their product until the end of the growing season. And so when they then go to sell their goods, they're not able to sell them at the price that they had planned for, and this compounds their economic problems. Now, that kind of closes out what I want to talk about regarding the overall picture of the economic issues. Let's kick over to taking a look at some of the political issues going on at the time. So 1920, Warren G. Harding wins the presidency. And if we're going to talk about College Board's assessment of this time period, Warren G. Harding's presidency is considered one of the most corrupt in U.S. history. Oftentimes, College Board will have you kind of compare, contrast Harding's presidency versus Grant's presidency. And whereas Grant, for the most part, from what I've read, was pretty solid character, but under his presidency, that whole corruption and patronage system really led to a fleecing of the country. For Warren G. Harding, perhaps it was the fact that he was maybe the wrong guy for the for the job. And so we'll take a look at that. Regarding that, I actually have a quick little article from Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, that I post up for you in Schoology, so please take a look at it. Gladwell talks about something called the Harding effect, that while Warren G. Harding, maybe his background did not set him up to be a very strong president, he fit the bill in terms of our expectations of a president. He looked presidential, but then kind of Gladwell gets after the extent to which he really was well suited for the job. One of the things I'd like you to focus on for Harding is the impact of the Ohio gang. So what I'll do is, for Harding's presidency, we'll talk about the highlights of his presidency and then a little bit of the dim bulbs. And we'll do that from the viewpoint of the individuals in his presidency. So some of the highlights for Warren G. Harding were Charles Hughes, the Secretary of State, Andrew Mellon, Secretary of Treasury, Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce, and William Howard Taft, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And we've talked about Taft before, so I'll focus a little bit more on Hughes, Mellon, and Hoover. When I put this PowerPoint together, sitting in my study, I was getting a little wonky with maybe a little bit too much information on these characters. So I'll try and pull myself back a little bit, and we'll just focus on kind of what you should know about them from the viewpoint of being able to name drop if you were asked to write an LEQ about the 1920s. So Charles Hughes, first of all. So the two things I would say to focus on for Hughes was his leadership in chairing the Washington Naval Conference, right? You have a kinder, gentler APUSH. Back in the day, APUSH students needed to know the 4, the 5, the 9 powers treaties, which countries were involved, what they were about. In reality, probably what you should focus on is the Washington Naval Conference was about trying to work at moves to disarm the world's military, right? So try to address some of those issues that led to World War I. So, it focused on limitation of naval weapons, of fortifications, trying to leave an open door to China, trying to avoid those spheres of influence we talked about during U.S. imperialism. So that would be one of the main takeaways for Hughes. Hughes also ended hostilities with Germany. You got to keep in mind, we didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles, but under Hughes' leadership, the United States sets up our own peace agreement with Germany. Andrew Mellon. Mellon, some of his highlights under Harding's presidency was the fact that he helped reduce the national debts. He was really trying to trim the national budget. And he did so by kind of limiting the expenditures coming out of the federal government. He also focused on lowering taxes. And we talked about the creation of the income tax. And so he tries to, and is successful at, lowering the tax rates at which people were being charged. Then we have Herbert Hoover, and we saw Hoover before with the Food Administration in World War I. Now, Hoover's interesting, and I think is probably the most important of these individuals to focus on, because he becomes president later on, and Hoover's response to the Great Depression is oftentimes compared and contrasted with Roosevelt's. Hoover has, and definitely at the time, took the brunt of criticism for the Great Depression and probably gets way more of the blame than he really necessarily deserves. So some of the key things to know about Herbert Hoover was he actually believed in a balance between labor, capital, and government, right? So he wasn't all just kind of laissez-faire, pro industry. He really did look for a balance between these forces. He generally was kind of, I don't know if disliked is quite the right word, but the old guard that we had discussed under Taft's presidency was didn't really support Herbert Hoover. So Hoover's rise to the Secretary of Commerce, was actually tied with Andrew Mellon, so to try and kind of bring some of those old guard into supporting Hoover. And one of the things that Hoover focused on was infrastructure spending in 1920 to 1921. So during the Depression that followed World War I, he actually was pretty active in using federal government resources to help support the post-war recession. Now, one of the things that we definitely need to understand and recognize are the dim bulbs that came from Warren G. Harding's presidency. And that's Albert Fall and Harry Doherty. So Fall was Secretary of the Interior and Doherty was the Attorney General, both coming from the Ohio gang that helped support Harding's rise to the White House. So for Albert Fall, he was a anti-conservationist, and we had already talked about the perception of Taft turning against conservation and how that really was a thorn in the side for the progressive Republicans and many of the Americans at the time. So Fall is cut from that same fabric. But really what solidifies Fall in the history books is his involvement in the Teapot Dome scandal. This scandal was the top governmental scandal all the way up until the Watergate scandal. And we have an additional reading for you up in Schoology to take a look at. It's a fairly quick read, but a pretty good one regarding Teapot Dome. So basically what he did was he took bribes to allow private oil companies to drill on the Strategic Naval Oil Reserve, which was something that some folks believed was legal at the time, but later on it was deemed now that it was illegal, and accepting bribes to open up that drilling certainly was not in good form. But Harding's presidency was not just judged by these individuals, but by some of his own personal behaviors. But we'll get to that in just a little bit. So the second dim bulb from Harding's presidency was Harry Doherty. He was a former small-time lawyer. There were questions about corruption as a small-time lawyer in Ohio. So what he did during this time period of Prohibition was he actually sold liquor permits. So at this time it was illegal to make and sell alcohol unless you had a permit, right? And so hospitals had permits, religious institutions had permits, and he would then sell you a permit for the right price. He also doled out pardons for violating the Volstead Act, but then also pardons for other actions. In fact, notably, he pardoned Eugene Debs for his protest to World War I. And then the last slide regarding Harding is just kind of a breakdown of some of the other issues involved with his own personal behavior. He was a drinker, gambler, womanizer. He actually had an illegitimate daughter who his campaign kind of hid away from the American public at the time. He would host burlesque shows. He's oftentimes referred to as thoroughly mediocre. His speeches and leadership, for the most part, is referred to as vague and ambivalent. Some of his speeches were referred to as kind of a series of words kind of floating around looking for a point. And then obviously at the end of his presidency, Teapot Dome scandal and kind of the mysterious death. There was no autopsy. Mrs. Harding refused to allow autopsy to occur, and the country kind of said, all right, and moved on. Now, it is important to note that regarding the Teapot Dome scandal, I've never come across information that directly ties Harding to the Teapot Dome scandal, but the fact that he allowed all of this type of corruption to occur under his presidency is what is so questionable. So Harding dies, and Calvin Coolidge, vice president, steps up to the helm. And I think this political cartoon does a great job of showing you the main goal of Coolidge. And so here you see Coolidge with hot water from the Teapot Dome trying to scrub down, clean up the elephant representing the Republican Party, and politics and the press are looking in through the window to see how things go. So let's take a little bit of time to focus on Silent Cal, being cool with Calvin Coolidge and his efforts to try and restore confidence in the White House. So Calvin Coolidge, famous quotation from Coolidge, "The chief business of the American people is business." And so that helps kind of frame his presidency and the focus of his goals for the federal government. So Coolidge very much supports laissez-faire government, right? So hands off, a very minimal role that the federal government plays in the United States. He did help restore public's faith in the White House after this major scandal had hit. And in terms of progressive support, he was a staunch supporter of racial equality. And you see here an image of Coolidge with Native Americans after Coolidge signs into law allowing Native Americans U.S. citizenship. And we had talked about that before, about how the treatment of the Native Americans by the federal government had been just so consistently detrimental. And not that necessarily that changes here at this time, but it is a real positive for Coolidge regarding racial equality. Regarding foreign affairs, Coolidge reflected a lot of what Americans thought regarding foreign affairs at the time with very little interest, right? So we do have this time period of relative isolation following World War I. The economic legacy of the 1920s. So let's talk about just a couple other things that come about because of these political issues, right? So we have massive growth of industry and big business. And from this comes some questionable behaviors. There's pyramid scheming, so Ponzi scheming that starts to occur, and rampant speculation, right? So that ties back to investor confidence that the economy was going to do well. We had a government that was supporting big business and business growth, and it created more and more risky economic behaviors. We also have the crumbling agricultural economy. So the farmers are having more and more, or experiencing more and more struggles in the 1920s. And while Congress tried to draft support for the agricultural community, that wasn't Coolidge's thing, right? He was focused on business and stood in the way to a certain extent. And many of these issues then are going to set the stage for the Great Depression. First and foremost, under Coolidge's presidency, he exercises the Ford-Macomber tariff. And what this does is, just like other tariffs that we've talked about before, it raises tax rates on imported goods, right? So it supports domestic industrial production. But what it kicks into gear, what it triggers, is a tariff war internationally. And so as we raise tariff rates against foreign goods, those countries, France, raise tariff rates on our goods, and it's going to bring us closer and closer to tensions and an explanation as to how and why we have a stock market crash that then helps lead to a Great Depression.